The door slammed open so hard I thought it might come off its hinges. I barely had time to react before my best friend Brandon burst into my apartment, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. He stumbled inside, collapsing onto the couch like someone who had just run a marathon. I stared at him, my heart pounding from the sheer shock of his entrance. What the hell happened? I asked, trying to catch my breath. Brandon didn't respond immediately. His hands were trembling as he rubbed his face, his eyes wide and unfocused. It was as if he couldn't process what had just happened. "You're not going to believe it," he finally muttered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head hanging low. "I messed up, man. I messed up bad." The tension in the room was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I had never seen him like this, not in all the years we'd known each other. Something was seriously wrong. "Talk to me, Brandon," I urged, taking a seat across from him. "What's going on?" Just then, the front door creaked open again, but this time much more gently. I turned around to see my stepmother, Charlotte, stepping inside. She was staying with me for the weekend, just a casual visit, or so I had thought. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes, an awareness, a knowing look that immediately made my stomach turn. She glanced between me and Brandon, her lips curling into a soft, almost unreadable smile. Brandon froze, his eyes locking with hers for a moment that stretched too long to be comfortable. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice as smooth as ever, as though she hadn't just walked into what felt like the aftermath of some silent disaster. I didn't know how to answer. The air was thick with something I couldn't yet understand, but I felt it creeping in. The silence that followed her question hung in the air like a thick fog. I glanced at Brandon, hoping for him to say something, anything to break the tension, but he remained silent, staring down at his hands like a man lost in his own mind. Charlotte stepped further into the room, her heels clicking lightly against the wooden floor, and sat down next to Brandon on the couch, much closer than I would have expected. She wasn't acting like someone oblivious to the situation. She knew something. That much was clear. I watched as she rested her hand gently on Brandon's shoulder, her touch deliberate, lingering. And she said softly, her voice low but filled with that same calmness, the kind that makes you feel like she already knows your answer. "You're not yourself. What's going on?" His head shot up, eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and something else I couldn't quite place, but he didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, it seemed to ground him, if only for a moment. My stepmother had a way of controlling the room without saying much. It was unsettling, the way she could shift the atmosphere with just a glance or a gesture. It's nothing, Brandon muttered, finally breaking the silence, though his voice trembled. He looked at me briefly, as if searching for a way out. But then his gaze quickly darted back to Charlotte, who hadn't moved. "Nothing," she echoed, her hand still resting lightly on his shoulder. "You don't seem like yourself, Brandon." And then it happened. Out of nowhere, as if the tension in the room snapped all at once, Brandon turned to her, his face inches from hers. The movement was almost reflexive, as if he was being pulled in by an invisible force. Their faces were so close now that I felt like I was intruding on something private, something I had no right to witness. Before I could process what was happening, their lips met. It wasn't sudden or aggressive, but a slow, deliberate act. Brandon didn't resist. He leaned in, his hand awkwardly finding her wrist, as though he wasn't sure whether to stop or follow through. The kiss seemed to linger, and I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. It wasn't about attraction or romance. It felt more like a crossing of boundaries, a violation of some unspoken rule that none of us had anticipated breaking. I wanted to say something to snap them out of whatever was happening, but the words stuck in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, but it was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. Charlotte pulled away first, her expression unchanged, as if the kiss hadn't rattled her in the slightest. She looked at Brandon with the same calm demeanor she'd had when she first entered the room. But there was something in her eyes now, something different. Brandon, on the other hand, seemed dazed, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He turned to me, his face flushed and full of panic. I could see the regret setting in, the confusion, but it was too late. He started, but his words trailed off. His voice sounded hollow, like he didn't even believe what he was trying to say. I stood up, feeling the need to move, to put space between myself and whatever this was. But instead, I just stood there, frozen in place. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Charlotte, seemingly unfazed, rose to her feet and walked to the window. She didn't look back at either of us. Her back was turned, her reflection in the glass showing nothing but composure. "I think we all need a little air," she finally said, almost to herself. Brandon sat there, head in his hands now, breathing hard. I didn't know what to say to him. There were no words that could undo what had just happened. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, realizing that this was only the beginning of something I couldn't control, something none of us could control. But no one moved. The rest of the evening crawled by in unbearable silence. After the kiss, none of us knew how to act. Brandon sat motionless on the couch, his head hanging low, while Charlotte remained at the Gelac window, her back still turned to us. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second dragging on longer than the last. I cleared my throat, the sound harsh in the otherwise quiet room. I think maybe we should call it a night. My voice was stiff, strained as though I was struggling to push out the words. I had no idea what else to say. What could I say? What just happened between them wasn't something we could casually brush aside. Brandon looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like he was agreeing with me, but didn't have the strength to speak. He stood up slowly, as if every movement required an immense amount of effort. Without looking at Charlotte again, he mumbled something about needing to leave. But Charlotte turned around before he could make it to the door. Her expression was unreadable, calm, collected, as if the kiss that had just transpired wasn't tearing apart the fabric of everything we knew. "Brandon, are you sure you're all right to drive?" Her tone was so composed, so normal it made my skin crawl. How could she pretend nothing was wrong? Brandon stopped in his tracks, hesitating for a moment before turning around to face her. "I'll be fine," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. It was obvious that he just needed to get out of there. I didn't blame him. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and staying in that room felt suffocating. I walked him to the door, wanting to say something to ease the tension, to somehow make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't find the words. Neither could he. Instead, we exchanged a brief, awkward glance, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night. I closed the door behind him and turned around to find Charlotte still standing by the window. Her arms folded across her chest. The silence between us stretched on, the weight of it unbearable. I don't know what that was. I finally blurted out, the frustration in my voice betraying how shaken I was. But it can't happen again. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she watched me carefully, as if weighing her options before speaking. I didn't plan for it to happen either. She said finally, her voice soft but firm, "But you need to understand something. This isn't just about tonight." Her words hung in the air, filling the room with more questions than answers. I took a step toward her, my heart racing. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte sighed, turning her gaze back to the window. "It means things are already more complicated than you realize." She glanced at me out of the corner of her eye, her face composed almost emotionless. "And you need to be ready for that." I stood there trying to process her words. What was she saying? I didn't understand, or maybe I didn't want to. I didn't want to believe that this was just the beginning of something larger, something we couldn't control. Charlotte walked past me, heading toward the stairs. "Get some rest," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "We can talk about it tomorrow." I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of anger and confusion. The evening had gone from ordinary to something unrecognizable, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with her. But one thing was clear. Nothing was going to be the same after tonight. The next morning, I woke up feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. The events of the previous night still hung over me like a dark cloud. I stayed in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The kiss, the tension between Brandon and Charlotte, the words she had left me with. It all felt like a puzzle that I didn't have the pieces for. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. I couldn't avoid this any longer. There was no escaping it. I headed downstairs to the kitchen, where I found Charlotte already seated at the table, sipping her coffee like nothing had happened. The sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on everything, but it felt out of place, like the light was mocking the heaviness I felt inside. "Morning," she said, her tone casual as if we were still living in some normal version of reality. I muttered a response, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting down across from her. My hands were shaking slightly as I lifted the cup to my lips. I had to address it. I couldn't let this silence hang between us anymore. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I actually felt. Charlotte didn't even flinch. She set her coffee down carefully, folding her hands on the table in front of her. "I figured you'd say that," she replied calmly. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since last night, I felt like she wasn't in control. There was a flicker of something there, something human, like uncertainty. What happened last night, I began struggling to find the right words. I don't know what it was, but it can't happen again. None of it. The kiss, Brandon leaving the way he did. It's all wrong. She tilted her head slightly, studying me. And why is it wrong? I blinked, taken aback by her question. Why? Because you're my stepmother, Charlotte. Because Brandon's my best friend. And what happened between you two? It crosses a line that shouldn't even exist. She nodded slowly, as if processing what I was saying. I understand, she said finally, her tone softer now. But what you don't seem to realize is that lines are only there if we believe in them. I stared at her, not knowing how to respond to that. What was she even saying? That we could just pretend it never happened, or that it didn't matter? "I'm not trying to make excuses," Charlotte continued. "I know how it looks, but Brandon was in a vulnerable place last night. He wasn't himself, and maybe, just maybe, I wasn't either." I set my coffee down, the bitter taste still lingering in my mouth. "So what happens now?" I asked. My voice quieted her as though I was afraid of the answer. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "That depends on you and on Brandon. I'm not going to force anything, and I'm not going to pretend nothing happened, but we have to face it. The question is how." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what the right move was. Everything felt too complicated, too tangled up in emotions I didn't even want to acknowledge. Before I could say anything more, there was a knock at the door. The sound startled both of us. Charlotte looked toward the door, and I felt my stomach drop. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Brandon stood there, looking worse than he had the night before. His eyes were red, his hair disheveled. He didn't say a word as I stepped aside to let him in. He walked past me, his movements stiff, like he didn't really want to be there, but didn't know where else to go. Charlotte remained seated at the table, her face expressionless as Brandon sat down across from her. "We need to talk," Brandon said, echoing the same words I had just spoken minutes before. His voice was rough, raw, like he hadn't slept. "About last night," Charlotte nodded, her gaze steady. "I know. I watched the two of them, feeling like I was on the outside of something I didn't understand." Brandon's eyes flicked to me, then back to her. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Charlotte leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "You don't have to know right now," she said softly. "We'll figure it out together." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't tell if it was from fear or relief. Brandon seemed to relax, just a little, like the weight of last night was still there, but slightly less crushing. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, but none of us knew how to break the silence. The situation was too fragile, too unpredictable, and I still didn't know where it would lead. The tension between us never fully lifted. Even as we sat there in silence, it was clear that nothing had truly been resolved. I kept glancing between Brandon and Charlotte, wondering what was going on beneath the surface of their calm exteriors. My thoughts were racing, but I felt powerless to stop any of this from spiraling further, out of control. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking towards Charlotte, then quickly back to the table. I could tell he was struggling to find the words, but every time he opened his mouth to speak, he seemed to think better of it and felt silent again. Finally, I broke the stillness. "So, what are we supposed to do now?" My voice sounded strained, like I was trying too hard to appear in control. I wasn't. Nothing about this situation felt manageable anymore. Charlotte, sitting across from me, didn't flinch. She met my eyes with that same unreadable expression she'd worn all morning. "I think we need to take a step back," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "We all need time to figure out what this means." "What this means," Brandon repeated, his voice sharp. "It doesn't mean anything, Charlotte. What happened last night? It was a mistake." His hands were clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white. "Yui, this is all wrong." Charlotte tilted her head slightly, observing him. "Is it?" she asked, her tone quiet but probing. "Are you sure it's just a mistake?" Brandon didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched and he looked away, staring out the window. I could see the turmoil on his face, the way he wrestled with what she was saying. And that's when it hit me. Brandon wasn't just reacting out of guilt or confusion. There was something more. "Brandon, what are you trying to say?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't meet my gaze. "I don't know," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm trying to say. I can't get it out of my head." My stomach twisted at his words. He wasn't talking about regret. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't just confused by what had happened. He was haunted by it. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving him. "It's okay to be confused, Brandon," she said, her voice soft, almost comforting. "But you need to be honest, with yourself and with me." He flinched at that, but still, he said nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. The tension between them, the weight of whatever was unspoken, was suffocating. "This isn't healthy," I blurted out, my frustration finally boiling over. "We can't just sit here and pretend like everything's going to work itself out. We need to address this. All of it, now." Charlotte's gaze shifted to me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes. Something that made my skin prickle. "And what exactly are we addressing?" She asked, her voice low. "What is it that you think needs to be resolved?" The way she said it, like I was missing something obvious, made me hesitate. I searched for the right words, but nothing came. Everything I wanted to say felt jumbled, tangled up in my own emotions. Brandon stood abruptly, pushing back his chair with a loud scrape. "I can't do this," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I need to get out of here." I didn't wait. I called after him, but he was already halfway to the door. He didn't stop, didn't turn around. I watched as he disappeared out the front door, leaving me alone with Charlotte once again. The silence that followed was deafening. I turned back to face her, my heart pounding in my chest. "You need to stop," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "Whatever you're doing, you need to stop." She didn't respond at first. She just sat there watching me with those same unreadable eyes. Slowly, she rose from her chair and walked over to the window, looking out at the driveway, where Brandon had just left. "You don't understand," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "It's not that simple." I stood there, frozen in place. "What do you mean?" Charlotte turned to face me, her expression softer now, but there was something guarded in her eyes. "I mean, none of this is what you think it is." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I had no idea what she meant by that, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. The house felt impossibly quiet after Brandon left. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I stood there, still trying to make sense of Charlotte's last words. "None of this is what you think it is." What did she mean by that? Was she playing some kind of game, or was there more to this than I could see? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. Something important that I didn't understand yet. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for them. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself in the kitchen, standing at the counter, mindlessly rinsing a glass. I kept running the events of the last 24 hours through my mind, trying to piece it all together. The kiss, Brandon's reaction, Charlotte's cryptic words. It all felt like part of a larger puzzle I couldn't solve. I heard the soft click of heels behind me, and when I turned around, Charlotte was there. She stood in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, her expression unreadable. As always, the sunlight from the window cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel surreal, like we were both caught in some strange limbo. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of urgency that hadn't been there before. She stepped into the kitchen, crossing the space between us in just a few strides. I set the glass down, wiping my hands on a towel, and faced her. "Yeah, we do," I agreed, though I wasn't sure where to start. "What's going on, Charlotte?" "You said things aren't what they seem. What does that even mean?" She sighed, folding her arms across her chest. It means you're only seeing part of the picture. You're focusing on what happened last night, but there's more to it than that. More than you realize. I frowned, frustration bubbling up again. What do you mean more? This isn't some puzzle, Charlotte. Brandon kissed you. You kissed him back. That's what happened. There's nothing else to it. Charlotte stepped closer, her gaze locking onto mine. You think that's all it was? A kiss? You really believe it's that simple? Her words were like a challenge, and I could feel my patience slipping. Then explain it to me. I shot back, my voice rising, because right now, none of this makes sense. There was a pause, a long moment, where the tension between us grew so thick I could almost feel it pressing down on me. Then Charlotte took another step forward, so close now that I could see the subtle rise and fall of her breathing. Her eyes were searching mine, as if trying to decide how much to reveal. You're right, she said softly, almost too softly. It wasn't just about the kiss. It's about something deeper, something that's been building for a long time, and you've been part of it too. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I didn't understand what she was getting at. What did she mean I was part of it? Before I could form a coherent thought, Charlotte reached out, her hand brushing lightly against my arm. It was such a simple gesture, but it sent a shockwave through me, as if her touch carried the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. I stepped back instinctively, putting some distance between us, but the kitchen suddenly felt smaller, like there was nowhere to escape. You're trying to manipulate this, I said, my voice unsteady. You're trying to twist it into something it's not. Charlotte shook her head, her expression softening. No, I'm not twisting anything. I'm just telling you the truth, whether you're ready to hear it or not. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to keep pushing to demand answers, but another part of me, perhaps the smarter part, was terrified of what I might find out if I did. I don't want to play games, I finally said, my voice quieter now. I just want to understand what's happening here. With you, with Brandon, with all of this. Charlotte gave me a long, measured look, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes. It's not a game, she said quietly. It's never been a game. There was another pause, another moment where the silence between us felt heavy with unsaid things. I could feel the tension building again, but this time it was different. This time it felt like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us could back control. Before I could stop myself, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since the night before. Do you regret it? What happened with Brandon? Charlotte looked away for a moment, her expression unreadable once more. And with a sigh, she met my eyes again. No, she said, her voice steady. I don't regret it, but I also don't expect you to understand that. Her words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to argue to tell her she was wrong, but deep down I wasn't sure I could. The room fell into silence again, and I realized that whatever came next was going to change. Everything. Nothing would be the same after this conversation. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. The weight of Charlotte's words lingered in the room, pressing down on me as I stood there in silence. I didn't know how to respond, or if there was anything left to say. Her admission, no regret, echoed in my mind, and I felt a tightness in my chest, like something inside was starting to unravel. Charlotte hadn't moved. She stood there, her gaze still fixed on me, waiting for some kind of reaction. But what could I say? That I was angry, confused? I was both. But the deeper truth was something I wasn't ready to face. There was a part of me that didn't want to confront what was happening between us. I turned away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as if that could somehow steady me. The silence between us was too loud, too charged with everything that had been left unsaid. The air felt thick, like it was impossible to breathe properly. I don't know how we got here, I muttered, more to myself than to her. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. I do, she said softly, and those two words sent a chill down my spine. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to regain control of the situation. But control felt like something distant, unreachable. When I turned back to face her, Charlotte had stepped closer. I hadn't noticed how near she was until she was right in front of me, her presence filling the small space between us. I could see the quiet intensity in her eyes, an intensity that made it impossible to look away. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. We had crossed too many lines already for those kinds of labels to matter. Without thinking, or maybe because thinking had become too difficult, I reached for her. It was a reflex, a momentary lapse in judgment that I couldn't pull back from. My hand brushed against her arm, and in that instant something shifted again between us. She didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, she took a small step forward, so close now that I could feel her breath. And before I knew what was happening, her lips met mine. This kiss was different from any other that had come before it. There was no hesitation, no questioning what was happening or why. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was slow, deliberate, like we both knew exactly what this moment meant, even if neither of us was ready to admit it. I don't know how long we stood there, but when she finally pulled back, the room felt impossibly still. I opened my eyes, and for a moment everything seemed frozen in place. Her expression was calm, but there was something new in the way she looked at me. Something I hadn't seen before. Neither of us spoke. What could we say? Words felt irrelevant now, too small to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. Instead, we stood in the silence, the reality of the situation settling over us like a heavy blanket. I stepped back, breaking the invisible thread that had held us so close together just moments before. My mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had just occurred. But the one thing I couldn't deny was the undeniable truth. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Charlotte exhaled softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You understand now, don't you?" I didn't know what she meant by that. Did I understand? No, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that things had changed between us in a way that couldn't be reversed. "I need to go," I said, the words coming out quicker than I had intended. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head. I couldn't be in that room with her any longer without everything collapsing in on itself. But before I could move toward the door, it swung open, and there was Brandon standing in the doorway. His eyes went from me to Charlotte, and something passed across his face, something I couldn't quite place. He had seen enough. Whatever had happened between us in those brief moments, it was clear from his expression that he knew. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and almost unbearable. "I came back to talk," Brandon said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. But his eyes were locked on Charlotte, and for a second I thought he might say something more, something that would shatter the fragile balance we were all holding on to. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. The weight of his presence alone was enough to make everything feel even more surreal. Charlotte straightened, her expression as unreadable as ever, though I could tell something had shifted in her too. She crossed her arms lightly across her chest, watching Brandon with that same quiet intensity. "We can talk," she said, her voice calm, "but we need to be honest with each other." Brandon's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer. "Yeah, we do," he said, his tone sharp. "But are you ready for that?" It was clear from his voice that this conversation wasn't going to end well. The tension in the room was suffocating. Brandon's words hung in the air like a weight none of us could shake off. Charlotte stood across from him, her calm demeanor now cracking slightly under the pressure of whatever was about to come next. I could feel it too. Something was building, and I wasn't sure any of us were ready for where this conversation was going. Brandon didn't sit down. He stayed standing, arms crossed, his gaze shifting between me and Charlotte. His eyes, once full of confusion and vulnerability, were now hardened, as if he had finally made up his mind about something. I could see the change in him, and it made my stomach churn. "You think you can just manipulate us, don't you?" He said, his voice low but steady. "Play us against each other like none of this matters, like we won't figure it out." Charlotte's eyes flashed, but she didn't respond right away. Her silence felt deliberate, as though she were waiting for him to say something more, something she already knew was coming. And maybe she was right to wait, because when Brandon spoke again, the words hit like a punch I hadn't seen coming. "I've known for a while now," Brandon said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I just didn't want to believe it, but last night it all clicked. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sounding distant like it wasn't really mine. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't know why. Brandon's gaze flicked toward me for a split second before returning to Charlotte. "You've been pulling us into this mess for your own reasons," Brandon continued, ignoring my question. "But here's the thing, Charlotte. You're not the only one who knows how to play this game." Charlotte's face remained unreadable, but her hands tightened slightly where they rested at her sides. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" she asked, her voice measured but with a slight tremor. Brandon let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You know exactly what I'm accusing you of. You've been messing with us, using us to fill whatever void you've got going on. But it's not just about us, is it?" My mind raced, trying to keep up with what was being said. This wasn't the conversation I expected, and now it felt like I was missing pieces of a story I thought I understood. "What are you talking about?" I asked again, louder this time. My frustration was boiling over, but both of them seemed locked in their own private battle, as if I wasn't even in the room. Brandon finally turned to face me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice softening, almost pitying. "She's been pulling us both along, but for what? For her own satisfaction? Or is there something deeper going on here?" I looked at Charlotte, hoping she'd deny it, explain everything away with her usual calm, but instead she just stared back at me. Her silence was louder than any explanation she could have given. That's when it hit me. There were things she hadn't told us. There were things we hadn't asked. Brandon took a step back, his face set in a grim expression. "I can't be part of this anymore," he said, his voice final. "I thought I could figure it out, but whatever this is, it's too messed up." He walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. I wanted to stop him to say something, but my throat felt tight, my mind racing too fast to form any words. Just as his hand touched the door handle, he paused, looking over his shoulder one last time. "If you're smart," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "you'll leave too, before it's too late." With that, he was gone. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, leaving me alone with Charlotte. The silence that followed felt unbearable, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't do a lift. I turned to face her, searching for some kind of explanation, some way to make sense of what had just happened. But when I looked at her, all I saw was a woman I didn't fully know. A woman who had secrets. What did he mean? I asked, my voice shaking. "What aren't you telling me?" Charlotte held my gaze, her face as calm as ever, but there was something in her eyes, now something darker, something I hadn't seen before. "There are things you're better off not knowing," she said quietly. "Things that don't need to be spoken." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to push for answers, to demand she tell me everything, but I didn't. For some reason I couldn't. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was something else. I took a step back, the space between us suddenly feeling like a chasm. "What are you hiding, Charlotte?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, walking toward the window, her back to me as the sunlight filtered in through the curtains. And in that moment, I realized something. I might never know the full truth. The room felt impossibly still, the weight of the unspoken hanging in the air like a shadow. And as I stood there watching her, one thought echoed in my mind. Maybe some things were never meant to be understood.